Consider the weight of iron in your hands, not the polished steel of a modern world, but raw iron, still warm from the forge, glowing with the memory of fire. In 1794, in a place where granite mountains rose like the bones of the earth itself, a boy named John Deere first learned that metal has memory. That heat can transform not just steel, but destiny. This is a story about what happens when preparation meets opportunity, when skill meets need, and when one man's understanding of how metal bends changes the face of a continent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Green Mountains of Vermont teach patience to those who listen. Each winter arrives with crystalline certainty, blanketing the valleys in snow that measures not in inches but in feet, in depths that transform the landscape into something both beautiful and unforgiving. The granite peaks stand witness to seasons that turn with the precision of a blacksmith's hammer, and in this place where stone meets sky, where forest meets clearing, a young boy learned the ancient language of fire and iron. John Deere was 4 years old when his father died. 4 years old when the man who should have taught him the trade, who should have stood beside him at the forge, who should have guided his first uncertain hammer blows, simply vanished from the world. The disease took William Deere swiftly, as diseases did in those days before modern medicine, before antibiotics, before the miracles we now take for granted. One day a father, the next day a memory, and a small boy left to navigate a world that had suddenly become much larger and much colder than he had ever imagined. But here is what you must understand about that moment, about that loss. In 1798 Vermont, there was no safety net, no social services, no insurance policies, no governmental programs to catch those who fell through fortune's cracks. There was only family, only community, only the willingness of neighbors to extend hands across the difficult spaces that tragedy creates. And sometimes, if you were fortunate, there was craft, there was skill. There was the possibility that your hands could learn to create value from raw materials, to transform the basic elements of earth into objects of utility and beauty. Sarah Deere, John's mother, faced the mathematics of survival with clear eyes. 5 children, no husband, no steady income, in a place where winter didn't ask permission before arriving. She could have returned to her family in Massachusetts, could have admitted defeat, could have chosen the easier path of dependence. Instead, she chose something harder. She chose to stay in Vermont, to keep her family intact, to find a way forward through the narrowing possibilities that widowhood presented. She found that way in Benjamin Lawrence, a master blacksmith whose forge glowed like a beacon in the Vermont darkness. Lawrence was the kind of man who understood that craft perpetuates itself through teaching, that knowledge means nothing if it dies with you, that the hammer you swing today shapes not just metal but the future. He agreed to take young John as an apprentice, to teach him the mysteries of the forge, to show him how iron bends and steel sings and heat transforms the fundamental nature of matter. Imagine being 11 years old and stepping into that world. The forge is a cave of fire and shadow, where the air itself seems to shimmer with heat. The anvil stands at the center like an altar, its surface bearing the scars of 10,000 hammer blows, each dent and mark a record of work performed, of metal shaped, of objects brought into being. Above, the bellows breathe with mechanical rhythm, feeding oxygen to coals that glow with temperatures that would melt skin from bone. The smell is overwhelming at first. Burning. Coal, hot metal, sweat, leather, oil. The sound is a constant percussion. Hammer on anvil, hammer on metal, the hiss of hot steel meeting water, the roar of the bellows. Everything moves in rhythm, in patterns established over centuries, in motions refined through countless repetitions until they become not just habit but instinct. Benjamin Lawrence stood at that anvil the way a captain stands at a ship's wheel, confident, commanding, reading the color of the metal the way sailors read the sky, knowing without thermometers or instruments exactly when iron reaches that perfect temperature, where it becomes malleable without becoming weak. Cherry red for bending, yellow for welding, white hot for the finest work. Each shade a language, each glow a conversation between smith and metal. He taught John to see, not just to look, but to see, to understand that metal is not dead matter, but something that responds, that remembers, that carries within its crystalline structure the history of every hammer blow, every heating, every cooling. Work a piece too cold and it cracks. Work it too hot and it burns, becoming brittle, losing the very properties that make it useful. But work it just right, at that perfect temperature with that perfect rhythm, and metal becomes almost liquid in its willingness to transform. The apprentice's first task is always the same, learning to maintain the fire, hour after hour, day after day. Young John Deere fed coal to the forge, pumped the bellows, kept the temperature steady. It seems like simple work, mindless work, the kind of task anyone could perform. But here is the secret. The fire is everything. Too hot and you waste coal, too cold and nothing works. The blacksmith must develop an instinct for heat, a feel for temperature that goes beyond measurement into something almost spiritual. Months passed before Lawrence allowed John to touch a hammer. More months before he allowed him to work actual metal. This was not cruelty but wisdom, the understanding that craft cannot be rushed, that mastery requires foundation, that you must learn to walk before you can run. And so the boy watched. He observed how Lawrence positioned his body, how he gripped the hammer, how he used the anvil's different surfaces for different purposes, the flat face for flattening, the rounded horn for curves, the hardy hole for cutting, the pritchel hole for punching. When John finally did pick up the hammer, his first attempts were disaster. The metal danced away from his blows, refusing to go where he wanted, mocking his efforts. His arms ached within minutes, his hands blistered within hours. The rhythm that looked so effortless when Lawrence performed, it became impossibly complex when attempted by novice hands. Strike too hard and the metal deforms wrong. Strike too soft and nothing happens. Strike off-center and the piece twists. But John Deere possessed something that no teacher can provide. Determination born from necessity. He was not apprenticing as a hobby or a temporary occupation. This was survival. This was the difference between poverty and prosperity, between dependence and independence, between being someone who consumed what others created and being someone who created what others consumed. Night after night, long after the other apprentices had gone home, John remained at the forge. He practiced on scrap metal, on pieces deemed worthless, on failed projects and broken tools. He taught his muscles the memory of correct motion, trained his eye to read heat, developed calluses that would last a lifetime. Lawrence would find him in the early morning darkness, already at work, the forge glowing, the hammer ringing, a young man possessed by the kind of focus that transforms ordinary skill into extraordinary mastery. The breakthrough came on a winter morning when John was 15 years old. Lawrence had been commissioned to create a set of door hinges for the new church being built in Middlebury, about 20 miles north. Hinges are deceptively complex. They must be strong enough to support heavy doors, smooth enough to operate without binding, precise enough to align perfectly, beautiful enough to complement the building. Each leaf must match its partner exactly. Each pin must fit its barrel with no play but no binding. Each scroll must curve with mathematical precision. Lawrence worked on the first hinge, demonstrating technique, explaining decisions. Then he handed John the hammer and the hot iron and told him to create the second hinge to match. The young apprentice took a deep breath, positioned the metal, raised the hammer, and began to work. His hands moved with newfound confidence, his strikes landing true, his rhythm steady. The metal responded, flowing under his hammer blows, transforming from rough bar stock into curved leaf, into elegant scroll, into the functional art that fine ironwork represents. 3 hours later, he plunged the finished hinge into the quenching barrel, and the water exploded into steam with that distinctive hiss that every blacksmith knows, the sound of transformation completing. Lawrence picked up both hinges, examined them, held them to the light, tested their movement. Then he did something he rarely did. He smiled. The hinges were identical, perfect. The work of a craftsman, not an apprentice. In that moment, without ceremony or announcement, John Deere had become a blacksmith. By 1821, when John was 17 years old, his reputation had spread throughout Vermont. Farmers brought him broken plows and dull scythes. Merchants commissioned ornamental ironwork. Housewives needed pots mended. fire irons forged, door latches crafted. His hands created objects that lasted generations, pieces that would outlive their creators, tools that made hard work possible. But Vermont, for all its beauty, for all its solid granite reliability, was a place of limits. The population was sparse, the economy agricultural but not of wealthy. A blacksmith could make a living but rarely a fortune, and John Deere, having spent his youth mastering the transformation of metal, began to understand that sometimes the craftsman himself must transform, must seek new opportunities, must take risks that feel impossibly large. News arrived from the West, like dispatches from another world. Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, territories opening to settlement, land selling for pennies per acre, towns springing up overnight, opportunities spreading across the prairies like wildflowers after rain. The stories spoke of virgin soil so rich it grew crops without fertilizer, of rivers teeming with fish, of forests filled with game, of a future waiting to be claimed by those brave enough or desperate enough to leave everything familiar behind. In 1836, John Deere made his decision. He would go west. He would leave Vermont, leave the mountains that had raised him, leave the forge where he had learned his craft, leave the community that knew his name and valued his work. He would take his family, his tools, his knowledge of how metal bends and fire transforms, and he would seek his fortune in a place he had never seen, among people he had never met, in service to opportunities he could only imagine. The journey itself was an odyssey through a nation still discovering itself. Roads were often mere trails, bridges were rare, rivers had to be forded or ferried. The Deere family travelled with everything they owned packed into a single wagon: clothing, tools, food supplies, the accumulated possessions of a life in Vermont. Each day brought new landscapes, new challenges, new evidence that America was vast beyond comprehension. They crossed mountains where the wagon wheels groaned against grades so steep that sometimes everyone had to walk to lighten the load. They forded rivers where the water rose to the wagon bed, and everyone held their breath praying the current wouldn't sweep them away. They camped in forests so dense that noon felt like twilight, where wolves howled in the darkness and every sound carried the weight of potential danger. But they also experienced beauty that defied description. Sunsets that painted the western sky in colors that seemed impossible, as if the universe itself was showing off, demonstrating the full spectrum of light. Meadows so vast you could walk for days without reaching the far edge, where grass grew tall enough to hide a horse, where wildflowers created carpets of color that stretched to the horizon. And always, always, the sense of space, of possibility, of a land waiting to be shaped by human hands and human dreams. After weeks of travel, after hundreds of miles, after countless small adventures and near disasters, the Deere family arrived in Grand Detour, Illinois. The town was barely a town at all, more an ambitious collection of buildings clustered where the Rock River made a sweeping bend, creating a natural harbor for boats carrying supplies and settlers. Perhaps a few hundred people called Grand Detour home, and every one of them was engaged in the same desperate enterprise, trying to transform wilderness into farmland, trying to wrest a living from soil that had never known the plough. John Deere set up his forge immediately, driven by the understanding that frontier communities needed blacksmiths the way humans need air. Tools broke constantly, horses needed shoeing, wagons required repair, buildings needed hardware. Within days, a line of customers formed outside his shop, each bringing projects that had been waiting for someone with Deere's skills to arrive. But he also heard something in those early days, something that would change everything. The farmers spoke with frustration, with exhaustion, with the kind of weariness that comes from fighting a battle you cannot win. They spoke about the soil, the prairie soil that should have been paradise, that looked so rich and black and promising that should have grown, crops of legendary abundance. Instead, it destroyed their ploughs. Every single day, ploughs broke. The wooden moldboards that worked perfectly in the sandy loam of the East Coast simply could not handle prairie soil. The soil clung to the wood like wet concrete, building up in thick layers that had to be scraped off every few steps. The constant stopping, the endless scraping, the frequent breaking of wooden components made ploughing so inefficient that some farmers were giving up, returning east, admitting defeat. John Deere, standing in his new forge in Grand Detour, Illinois, hearing these stories of failed plows and frustrated farmers, did not yet know that he was standing at the intersection of preparation and opportunity. He did not yet know that every hammer blow he had struck in Vermont, every lesson Lawrence had taught him, every hour spent understanding how metal responds to heat and force, had been preparing him for this exact moment. But he was about to find out. The singing plow was about to be born, and with it, the transformation of an entire continent was about to begin. The broken sawmill blade lay in the corner of John Deere's shop like a piece of forgotten scrap, its purpose seemingly exhausted, its value apparently spent. But here is what makes the story of innovation so remarkable. Sometimes the most revolutionary discoveries begin with refuse, with the discarded, with what others have deemed worthless. That blade, manufactured in Sheffield, England, shipped across an ocean, and hauled up the Mississippi River, contained within its steel structure exactly 0.7% carbon. Not 0.5%, not 1%, exactly 0.7%, the precise ratio that creates steel capable of holding an edge sharp enough to cut while maintaining flexibility enough not to shatter. John Deere did not know the exact chemistry when he picked up that blade in 1837. The science of metallurgy was still primitive, still based more on experience than analysis, still practiced by craftsmen who understood effects without comprehending causes. But he knew steel when he felt it. He knew quality when he worked it. And most importantly, he knew that this particular piece of metal possessed properties that the wooden plows breaking daily in Grand Detour's fields could never match. The idea came to him, not in a flash of sudden inspiration, but through the accumulated weight of conversations with farmers who were losing hope. Every day, someone came to his forge with another broken plow, another request to repair what prairie soil had destroyed. Every day, he heard the same frustration. The soil sticks, the wood breaks, the ploughing takes too long, we cannot make this work. And every day, as a blacksmith who understood materials at an instinctive level, he thought about solutions. Wood, no matter how well crafted, remains porous. Its surface, even when sanded smooth, contains microscopic valleys and peaks that give the sticky prairie soil something to grip. Worse, wood absorbs moisture from the soil, swelling and changing dimension, creating even more surface for the soil to cling to. Cast iron, the alternative that some plows used, was better than wood, but still relatively rough, and it was brittle, prone to shattering when encountering rocks or roots hidden in the unbroken prairie. But polished steel presented different possibilities entirely. Steel could be worked to a surface so smooth that water would bead and run off like mercury on glass. Steel would not absorb moisture, would not swell, would not change. And the right steel, with the right carbon content, would be tough enough to withstand impacts, while maintaining that crucial smooth surface that might, just might, allow prairie soil to slide away rather than cling. He began the work on a cold morning in March, when the forge fire felt particularly welcome against the lingering winter chill. The broken sawmill blade required heating, not to the white heat of welding, but to the cherry red of shaping. He positioned it in the coals, worked the bellows, watched the color change from dull gray to glowing crimson. When the moment was right, when the temperature had climbed to that perfect point between too cold and too hot, he pulled it from the fire and brought his hammer down. The steel resisted at first, as good steel does. It did not want to change shape, did not want to surrender the form it had held. But Deere was patient, was persistent, was guided by decades of experience in reading metal and understanding its moods. Blow after blow, reheat after reheat, the flat blade began to curve. Not just any curve, but a specific three-dimensional shape that would become known as a mold board, designed to lift soil, turn it, and cast it aside in a single fluid motion. The mathematics of the curve mattered immensely, though Deere worked by eye and instinct rather than equation. Too shallow, and the plough would not lift the soil properly. Too steep, and it would require impossible force to pull. He aimed for approximately 32 degrees of curvature, a shape that balanced the physics of soil movement with the practical limits of horse or ox power. Each hammer blow refined the curve, each heating adjusted the shape, until finally the mold board emerged from the process, looking almost organic, as if it had grown into that form rather than been forced into it. But the shape was only half the solution. The surface remained crucial. Deere spent hours with files and abrasives, removing every imperfection, eliminating every scratch, creating a finish that caught light like a mirror. This was not vanity, but engineering. Every microscopic irregularity represented a place where soil could grip, could build up, could transform the plough from tool into anchor. The surface had to be perfect, had to be smoother than anything most farmers had ever seen. He fashioned the rest of the plough. From materials at hand, wooden handles for steering, an iron share to cut the soil vertically, braces and bolts to hold everything together. The steel moldboard was the heart of the design, but the complete plough required traditional components working in concert with the innovation. When he finally stepped back to examine the finished product, it looked simultaneously familiar and revolutionary. Any farmer would recognize it as a plough, but no farmer had ever seen a plough that gleamed like polished silver. Lewis Crandall was a patient man, but patience has limits. He farmed 80 acres just outside Grand Detour, and in the spring of 1837, he had already broken 12 wooden ploughs trying to prepare his fields for planting. 12 ploughs. Each one had lasted hours, or at most a day before the prairie soil had defeated it, before the wood had cracked or the moldboard had broken or the whole assembly had simply surrendered to forces it was not designed to withstand. When John Deere approached him with a proposal to test a new design, Crandall's response was probably skeptical. He had heard promises before, had seen modifications and improvements that made no real difference. But he was also desperate, and desperation makes people willing to try things they might otherwise dismiss. So, on a morning in early April, when the soil was finally dry enough to work, Lewis Crandall hitched his oxen to John Deere's experimental steel plough and drove it to the field that had destroyed 12 ploughs that season. What happened next became legend. The steel share bit into the prairie soil, cutting through the dense mat of roots that held the earth together. The moldboard followed, lifting the soil, and then, instead of sticking, instead of building up in thick layers that would have required constant scraping, the soil slid away. It slid off that polished steel surface like water flowing downhill, like snow sliding off a steep roof, like the universe had suddenly decided that friction was optional. But there was more. There was sound. As the plough moved through the field, cutting furrows that lay neat and clean behind it, the moldboard began to ring. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clear, musical tone that carried across the prairie like a bell in the distance. The vibrations of soil sliding across steel at speed created resonance in the curved moldboard, and that resonance produced a note that would become the signature of success. Farmers who heard that sound knew immediately someone was ploughing with Deere's steel plough. Someone was winning the battle against prairie soil. They called it the singing plough, and the name captured something essential about the invention. This was not just a tool that worked better. This was a tool that announced its superiority, that made beautiful music while performing brutal labor, that transformed the exhausting work of ploughing from defeat to triumph. Lewis Crandall finished that first day, having ploughed more acres than he had managed in the entire previous week with wooden ploughs. And he had done it without stopping to scrape, without breaking handles, without the constant frustration that had characterized every previous ploughing attempt. News of the singing plough spread through the farming community with the speed that only truly useful information can achieve. This was not gossip or rumor, but practical intelligence that could mean the difference between successful harvests and crop failure. Farmers began appearing at Deere's forge, asking to see the plough, asking to buy one, asking if he could make them fast enough to prepare their fields before planting season ended. Deere found himself facing a problem that every inventor dreams of and dreads: demand that exceeds capacity. He could make ploughs one at a time in his forge, but farmers needed hundreds. He could use the broken sawmill blades he could find locally, but there were not enough to supply everyone who wanted his invention. He needed steel, high-quality steel, and he needed it in quantities that small-town Grand Detour could not provide. The solution lay 1,500 miles away, in Sheffield, England, where centuries of experience had created the finest steel manufacturers in the world. English steel was legendary for its consistency, its quality, its reliability, but it was also expensive, shockingly expensive when you factored in the cost of shipping it across the Atlantic Ocean and then up the Mississippi River to the Illinois frontier. English steel cost $100 per hundredweight, compared to $6 for locally produced American steel. Think about that ratio for a moment. English steel cost nearly 17 times as much as local alternatives. In modern terms, imagine choosing to buy a component that costs $17,000 when a $600 alternative exists locally. The decision seems insane, seems like the kind of financial mistake that destroys businesses before they begin. But John Deere understood something that the mathematics alone did not reveal. Quality is not just better, it is different. The local American steel of that era was inconsistent, varying wildly in carbon content, often containing impurities that made it brittle or weak or unable to hold the polish that made his plows work. So he made the expensive choice. He ordered English steel. He committed to quality even when it seemed financially reckless. And he built that quality into every plow he produced, knowing that farmers who paid premium prices for his plows expected them to work not just better but perfectly, not just the first season but for years of hard use. The production numbers tell the story of exponential growth, of an invention meeting desperate need. In 1839, 2 years after that first successful test in Lewis Crandall's field, John Deere produced 10 plows. 10 plows made by hand in a small frontier forge, each one representing days of careful work. By 1841, production had increased to 75 plows. By 1843, 400. And by 1846, just 9 years after the invention, 1,000 plows per year rolled out of a factory that Deere had built in Moline, Illinois, where the Mississippi River provided water, power, and transportation. But those numbers, impressive as they seem, obscure the human reality of what scaling production required. Deere had to transform himself from craftsman to businessman, from someone who made things with his own hands to someone who organized others to make things systematically. He had to source materials reliably, manage inventory, maintain quality control, handle finances, market products, and somehow preserve the innovation that made his plows superior while producing them in quantities that individual craftsmanship could never achieve. The journey to fetch English steel became a regular ordeal, a dangerous pilgrimage that Deere undertook multiple times each year. The Mississippi River in the 1840s was not the managed waterway of modern times, but a wild, unpredictable force that killed boatmen with casual frequency. Spring floods could turn the river into a raging torrent. Summer droughts could expose sandbars that tore hulls open. Storms appeared without warning, waves capsizing boats, cargo sinking to the bottom to rust away in the mud. Deere made these trips himself because he trusted no one else to select the steel his plows required. He would board steamboats in Moline and travel downstream to Street, Louis, where goods from the East Coast arrived by railroad. There he would inspect steel shipments personally, running his hands over the metal, checking for flaws, ensuring that the suppliers in Sheffield had sent what he had ordered. Then came the return journey upstream, fighting current, sometimes taking days to cover distances that downstream travel completed in hours. The competition arrived, inevitably, drawn by the obvious success of Deere's invention. Other blacksmiths studied his plows, attempted to copy his designs, made their own versions of steel moldboards. Some of these competitors produced adequate plows, a few produced good plows, but none could match the combination of quality materials and precise craftsmanship that made Deere's plows sing. Farmers learned to recognize the real thing, learned that the Deere name meant reliability, learned that paying more initially saved money over time because Deere plows lasted while copies broke. By the late 1840s, John Deere employed dozens of workers, managed a factory complex that covered several acres, and sold plows not just in Illinois but across the expanding American frontier. His invention had become an industry, his forge had become a factory, and his personal success had become intertwined with the agricultural transformation of an entire continent. But success brings complications, and growth demands resources. Every plow sold required steel purchased, workers paid, transportation arranged. Every expansion required capital, required taking risks with money that did not yet exist, required believing that future sales would justify present investments. The mathematics of business growth creates a paradox. The faster you succeed, the more money you need, and the more vulnerable you become to any disruption in the delicate chain of supply, production, and payment that keeps everything functioning. In 1857, that disruption arrived with the force of an earthquake, and John Deere, having conquered prairie soil and built an empire, would face his greatest test, not against stubborn earth or stubborn competition, but against the invisible forces of financial panic that destroyed businesses without mercy and transformed fortunes into ruins in the space of weeks. The singing plough would fall silent, and the blacksmith from Vermont would discover that surviving success can be harder than achieving it. August 24th, 1857, began as an ordinary day in most of America. Farmers tended crops, merchants opened shops, workers reported to factories. The sun rose over a nation that believed, with the confidence that prosperity breeds, that economic growth was not just likely but inevitable, that the future would always be brighter than the past, that the expansion westward meant expansion upward in wealth and security and comfort. By sunset, that confidence had evaporated like morning dew under merciless sun. The Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, one of the largest financial institutions in the nation, closed its doors. Not temporarily, not for repairs or inventory, but permanently, admitting insolvency so complete that depositors would recover only cents on the dollar if they recovered anything at all. The company had been speculating in railroad bonds, lending money to ventures that existed more on paper than in reality, building a pyramid of debt that required constant growth to avoid collapse. When growth stopped, when nervous investors began asking for their money back, when the underlying weakness of overextended credit became visible, the pyramid crumbled. And here is what makes financial panics so terrifying. They spread not through physical connection, but through psychological contagion. The failure of one institution makes people question the stability of others. Questioning leads to withdrawing deposits. Withdrawals force more institutions to close. More closures intensify the panic, and the cycle accelerates with exponential speed. Within a week, 30 banks had failed. Within a month, over 200. By the time the panic ran its course 12 weeks later, 5,000 businesses had vanished from the American economy. 5,000 enterprises, representing decades of accumulated effort, generations of family wealth, the labor of countless workers, simply ceased to exist. The survivors found themselves operating in an economic landscape transformed from abundance to scarcity, from confident growth to desperate survival. Grain prices, the lifeblood of agricultural America, collapsed by 70%. Wheat that sold for $2 per bushel in July brought 60 cents in September. Corn fell from 80 cents to 24 cents. These were not mere numbers on a ledger, but the destruction of livelihoods, the elimination of income, the difference between families eating and families starving. Farmers who had planted crops in spring confidence found themselves harvesting crops worth less than the cost of seed, and farmers who could not sell crops for decent prices could not pay their debts, could not pay for the plows they had purchased on credit, could not meet the payment schedules they had agreed to when times were good and the future seemed secure. John Deere, sitting in his Moline office reviewing accounts, faced a reality that would have broken lesser men: $42,000 in debts that farmers owed him but could not pay. $42,000 that existed on paper but not in his bank accounts, not in his safe, not anywhere he could actually use it to meet his own obligations, because he had obligations. Substantial obligations. Suppliers who had sold him English steel expected payment. Workers who had labored in his factories expected wages. Creditors who had loaned him money for expansion expected repayment according to agreed schedules. When Deere added up what he owed, the number came to $67,000. $67,000 that he had to pay while holding $42,000 in uncollectible debts. The mathematics were brutal. He owed more than farmers owed him. Even if he could somehow collect every penny that customers owed, even if he could force farmers already drowning in impossible economic conditions to pay their debts in full, he would still be $25,000 short. And he could not collect those debts, because collecting would mean taking plows back from farmers who needed them, would mean destroying the relationships he had built over 2 decades, would mean admitting that business success mattered more than human decency. The board meeting in September 1857 became one of the most crucial moments in the entire John Deere story. Around the table sat the men who had helped build the company: his son Charles Deere, his son-in-law Christopher Weber, and several other partners who had invested money and reputations in the enterprise. These were not strangers but family, people bound by blood and marriage and years of working together toward common goals. They came to that meeting with a proposal that made perfect financial sense. Liquidate the company. Sell the factories, the equipment, the inventory, everything of value. Use the proceeds to pay creditors as much as possible. Declare bankruptcy, absorb the losses, and start over with whatever remained. In the cold calculus of business survival, this was the rational choice, the sensible choice, the choice that protected individual interests, even if it meant sacrificing the collective enterprise. John Deere listened to their arguments, heard the logic, understood the fear that motivated their proposal. These were men watching a financial apocalypse destroy thousands of businesses, watching fortunes vanish overnight, watching the economic foundations of the nation crack and crumble. They wanted to save what they could before everything was lost. They wanted to cut their losses, to retreat, to survive by accepting defeat. And then John Deere said no. Not just no, but here is what we will do instead. Here is how we will not just survive, but emerge stronger. Here is how we will transform crisis into opportunity and disaster into triumph. What he proposed must have sounded like madness to men already terrified by what they were witnessing in the broader economy. Extend payment terms. Instead of demanding that farmers pay their debts according to the original aggressive schedules, give them 2 years, 2 full years to recover, to sell crops, to find the money they owed. This would mean Deere would not receive the cash he desperately needed, would mean his own cash flow problems would intensify, would mean he would have to somehow meet his obligations while his customers delayed paying theirs. Accept grain as payment. If farmers could not pay in cash, let them pay in wheat and corn and oats. Deere would become a grain merchant, taking payment in commodities and then selling those commodities for whatever price he could get. This added enormous complexity, required building storage facilities, demanded expertise in agricultural markets, and carried risk that grain prices might fall further before he could sell. Create the first equipment financing program in the agricultural industry. Develop a systematic approach to extending credit, to evaluating farmers' ability to repay, to managing installment payments, to balancing the need for sales with the reality of limited farmer resources. This would require tracking hundreds of individual payment schedules, sending reminders, negotiating adjustments, essentially becoming a bank in addition to being a manufacturer. The silence in that room must have been profound. These proposals did not solve the immediate crisis but made it worse. They deliberately chose long-term relationships over short-term survival. They gambled that farmers who received mercy would remember and reciprocate, that extending credit in the worst economy in American history would somehow lead to future prosperity rather than complete ruin. But there was more. There was a condition embedded in this proposal that John Deere either did not fully understand or chose to accept as the price of preserving his company. His partners, led by his son Charles and his son-in-law Christopher Weber, would take operational control. They would make the daily decisions, would manage the finances, would steer the company through the crisis. John Deere would remain involved but would surrender the absolute authority he had exercised since founding the company 20 years earlier. This was not merely a business arrangement but a family coup, a transfer of power disguised as pragmatic management. Charles Deere was 30 years old, ambitious, educated in ways his father was not, conversant with modern business practices that the old blacksmith had never formally studied. Christopher Weber brought financial expertise, connections to Eastern capital markets, and a willingness to make hard decisions. Together, they believed they could save the company if John Deere would step aside. And he did. Whether from exhaustion or wisdom, whether from recognition of his own limitations or simple love for his son and son-in-law, John Deere accepted the arrangement. He would lose control of the company he had built, would watch others make decisions he might disagree with, would become an employee rather than an owner in the practical sense. But the company would survive. The workers would keep their jobs. The farmers would get the mercy they needed. The implementation of these policies required extraordinary effort. Charles and Christopher created detailed accounting systems to track who owed what, when payments were due, what forms of payment had been accepted. They built grain silos to store the wheat and corn that farmers delivered instead of cash. They negotiated with banks and creditors, explaining their strategy, asking for patience, promising eventual repayment, while admitting they could not meet current schedules. Some creditors accepted these terms. Others did not. Several lawsuits were filed against the company, demanding immediate payment, threatening seizure of assets. Charles and Christopher fought these legal battles with the same intensity they brought to managing the business, hiring lawyers, appearing in court, negotiating settlements that often meant paying 40 or 50 cents on the dollar in exchange for time. The grain that farmers delivered as payment created its own challenges. Storage required constant vigilance against moisture, against vermin, against the natural tendency of organic material to spoil. Markets had to be monitored for opportunities to sell, because holding grain too long meant risking further price declines, but selling too quickly meant accepting losses that might have been avoided with patience. Charles Deere became expert in commodities trading, learning a skill set entirely separate from manufacturing but essential to surviving the financing arrangement his father had created. Through all of this, John Deere continued working. He still understood plow design better than anyone, still contributed innovations to product development, still represented the company's reputation to customers who had trusted him for decades. But he was no longer the final authority, no longer the man whose word was law, no longer fully in control of his own creation. The personal cost of his decision to extend mercy to farmers had been control of his company. The crisis stretched through 1858 and into 1859. Slowly, painfully, incrementally, the economy began to recover. Grain prices crept upward from their catastrophic lows. Banks reopened, credit became available again, and farmers who had received 2-year payment terms from John Deere began to pay. Not all of them, not immediately, but enough to demonstrate that the gamble had not been completely insane. Something else happened during those years, something that could not be measured in balance sheets or accounted for in ledgers. The farmers who had been granted mercy remembered. They remembered when they were drowning, and John Deere threw them a rope. They remembered when every other creditor was demanding immediate payment and Deere said, "Take your time." They remembered when the world seemed to be ending, and one company said, "We believe in you, we trust you, we will wait." That memory translated into loyalty that lasted generations. Farmers who bought a Deere plow in 1860 told their sons to buy Deere plows. Those sons told their sons. The brand became synonymous not just with quality products but with a company that valued relationships over short-term profits, that understood farming because the founder had been a blacksmith who listened to farmers, that could be trusted when times got hard because they had proven their trustworthiness in the hardest times imaginable. By 1860, the company had survived. Not just survived, but emerged in stronger competitive position than before the panic. Competitors who had demanded immediate payment had lost customers. Competitors who had liquidated during the crisis were gone entirely. Competitors who had tried to ride out the storm without fundamentally changing their approach were weakened. John Deere's company, having made the seemingly irrational choice to extend mercy, found itself with customer loyalty that money could not buy and competitors could not match. The financial numbers tell part of the story. The $42,000 in uncollectible debts gradually transformed into collectible debts. Not all of it, not quickly, but over the following 5 years, perhaps $30,000 was eventually recovered. The company paid back its $67,000 in obligations, settling accounts, rebuilding creditworthiness. By 1865, the books balanced again, and the company was profitable. But numbers cannot capture the human dimension of what had occurred. 800 farm families had been saved from bankruptcy by John Deere's decision to extend payment terms. 800 families kept their land, kept farming, kept their dignity and their futures because one company chose compassion over collection. The ripple effects of those 800 family survival stories spread through communities, created goodwill that transcended business transactions, established relationships based on something more enduring than commercial exchange. John Deere himself paid a price that few people recognized at the time. He was 63 years old when the panic struck, a man who should have been entering the comfortable final phase of his career, enjoying the fruits of decades of hard work. Instead, he He found himself subordinate to his son and son-in-law, watching them make decisions, seeing the company he had built being managed by others. Some men would have become bitter, would have fought against the loss of control, would have poisoned the family relationships with resentment. But Deere seemed to accept the change, with something approaching grace. Perhaps he understood that evolution requires letting go. Perhaps he recognized that the skills that build a company are not always the skills that sustain it through crisis. Perhaps he simply loved his family more than he loved authority. Whatever the reason, he continued contributing, continued innovating, continued representing the company's values while allowing others to manage its operations. The Panic of 1857 became a defining moment, not because it destroyed the company, but because it revealed character. In the crucible of financial apocalypse, when thousands of businesses chose self-preservation and failed anyway, John Deere chose mercy and survived. That choice established principles that would guide the company for over a century. Value relationships over transactions, invest in customers' success, take long views, even when short views seem safer. As the 1860s began, as the nation moved from financial crisis toward the even greater crisis of civil war, John Deere's company stood ready for the next phase of transformation. The singing plow had conquered prairie soil. The financing program had conquered financial panic. Next would come the iron horses, the railroads that would open 2 million square miles of new farmland and demand agricultural equipment on a scale that even John Deere, standing in his Vermont forge as a young man, could never have imagined. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory, two locomotives faced each other across a gap of rail just wide enough for a single spike. The Central Pacific Railroad, built eastward from California through mountain ranges that seemed designed to prevent human passage. The Union Pacific Railroad, built westward from Omaha across plains that stretched beyond imagination. When Leland Stanford drove that final golden spike into the rail tie, when the telegraph operator tapped out the single word "done" that flashed to waiting crowds in New York and San Francisco, the continent that had taken pioneers 6 months to cross could now be traversed in 6 days. But here is what the celebrations and speeches did not capture, what the dignitaries drinking champagne at Promontory Summit could not fully comprehend. They had just opened 2 million square miles of prairie to the plow. 2 million square miles of land that had been theoretically available but practically inaccessible. Land that was too far from markets to farm profitably. Land where the cost of transporting crops exceeded the value of the crops themselves. The railroad changed that calculation completely, transformed worthless distance into profitable proximity, and created demand for agricultural equipment on a scale that would require not forge work but industrial production. John Deere's factories in Moline responded like organisms sensing food. Production that had been measured in thousands now had to be measured in tens of thousands. In 1870, the company produced 53,000 plows. 53,000 plows, each one requiring steel, requiring labor, requiring the coordination of dozens of manufacturing processes. The old blacksmith's shop had evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to the young John Deere who had learned his trade in Vermont. The Bessemer steel process arrived in America during the 1860s, like a gift from the gods of industry. Named after Henry Bessemer, an English engineer who had discovered how to blow air through molten pig iron to remove impurities, the process transformed steel manufacturing from expensive art to affordable science. The chemistry was elegant. Oxygen in the blown air combined with carbon in the iron, creating carbon dioxide that bubbled away as gas, leaving behind steel of consistent quality in quantities previously impossible. The numbers tell the story. Before Bessemer, steel cost approximately $100 per ton to produce. After Bessemer, the cost dropped to $20 per ton, an 80% reduction in cost while simultaneously increasing strength by 40% through better control of carbon content and elimination of impurities. For a company like Deere that consumed steel by the trainload, this transformation meant they could produce better plows at lower cost and could compete more aggressively on price, while maintaining quality margins. Inside the Moline factory in 1875, a visitor would have witnessed industrial ballet choreographed by the twin demands of efficiency and precision. 2,000 workers moved through spaces organized by function. The forge, where steel arrived as bars and left as shaped components, the grinding room, where surfaces were polished to mirror smoothness, the assembly area where pieces came together into finished plows, the painting shop where green and yellow colours were applied that would become the company's signature. The steam hammers were monuments to controlled violence. Each one could deliver 20 tons of force in a single blow, shaping steel that would have required hundreds of hammer strikes by a blacksmith. The operator positioned the glowing metal, pulled a lever, and the hammer fell with apocalyptic force, the impact resonating through the floor, through the walls, through the bones of everyone nearby. Then up again, ready for the next blow, the rhythm maintaining productivity that individual craftsmanship could never match. The heat was overwhelming. Furnaces maintaining temperatures of 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit created an atmosphere that turned summer into ordeal. Workers drank water constantly, took salt tablets to replace what they sweated out, developed tolerances to heat that would have hospitalized newcomers. Winter, ironically, was the pleasant season in the forge, when the brutal heat became merely uncomfortable warmth. But it was in 1875 that the real battle began, when James Oliver introduced his chilled iron plough and declared war on John Deere's steel supremacy. Oliver had discovered that rapidly cooling cast iron created a surface almost as hard as steel, almost as smooth, and significantly cheaper to produce. His ploughs worked well in many soils, and his prices undercut Deere's by enough to make farmers notice. The competition became known as the Plough Wars, and the tactics deployed would have impressed military strategists. Deere salesmen and Oliver salesmen would arrive in the same towns, stage competing demonstrations in adjacent fields, invite farmers to witness side-by-side comparisons. The goal was not subtle persuasion but dramatic proof, and both companies approached these events with the seriousness of battlefield engagements. Sabotage was common. Oliver salesmen would sometimes scatter rocks in fields where Deere ploughs were being demonstrated, hoping to cause breakage that would embarrass the competition. Deere salesmen would plant their own people in crowds during Oliver demonstrations, ready to point out any imperfection, any hesitation, any moment when the Oliver plough did not perform perfectly. The farmers watching these demonstrations understood they were seeing theatre, but theatre that revealed genuine differences in performance. John Deere responded to the Oliver challenge with a guarantee that revolutionized the industry. Any plough that failed within 1 year would be replaced free of charge. No questions, no investigations, no requirements to prove the failure was not operator error. Just bring back the broken plough and receive a new one. This guarantee cost the company money when ploughs failed, but it created confidence among farmers who understood that Deere was literally betting the company's resources on the quality of their products. The competition drove innovation on both sides. Oliver improved his chilling process, made his ploughs more durable. Deere refined his steel formulations, improved his surface finishing techniques, developed new moldboard designs for different soil conditions. Farmers benefited from this rivalry, received better products at lower prices, enjoyed the attention that two giant companies paid to their needs and preferences. By 1880, the battle had largely been decided in Deere's favour, not through destroying Oliver, but through establishing that steel ploughs represented the premium option, the choice of farmers who wanted the absolute best, even if it cost more. Oliver's chilled iron ploughs remained popular and profitable, but Deere's steel ploughs dominated the markets where performance mattered more than price. The railroad expansion continued through the 1880s and 90s, pushing into territories that had seemed permanently beyond civilization's reach. Each new rail line opened new farmland, created new towns, generated new demand for ploughs and harrows and cultivators, and all the implements that transformed raw prairie into productive fields. Deere's production kept pace, growing from 53,000 ploughs in 1870 to over 200,000 implements of various types. By 1900, John Deere himself died in 1886, at the age of 82, having witnessed transformations that few humans experience in a single lifetime. He had seen the country expand from scattered coastal settlements to a continental empire. He had seen transportation evolve from wagons to railroads. He had seen manufacturing transform from individual craftsmen to industrial complexes employing thousands. And he had seen the company he founded with a single broken sawmill blade become the dominant force in American agricultural equipment. Charles Deere, who had taken operational control during the Panic of 1857, continued leading the company with the same long-term vision his father had demonstrated. He understood that the railroad age was temporary, that some new transformation would eventually arrive, that the company needed to keep evolving or risk becoming obsolete. He invested in research, in new manufacturing techniques, in building organizational capacity that could respond to changes no one could yet predict. The iron horses had transformed the prairie, had opened the continent, had created opportunities that exceeded even the optimistic predictions of the railroad builders. But they were just the beginning. The next revolution was already being imagined in workshops and laboratories across America, where inventors were experimenting with internal combustion engines, with machines that could replace horses entirely, with mechanical power that would make steam power seem as primitive as oxen pulling wooden plows through resistant soil. The Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company occupied a modest factory in Waterloo, Iowa, where a handful of engineers had been building small tractors since 1914. By 1918, when John Deere's company purchased it for $2.3 million, Waterloo had developed something remarkable: a tractor that actually worked reliably in field conditions, that farmers could operate without engineering degrees, that represented the future of agriculture, even if most farmers did not yet realize it. $2.3 million was an enormous sum in 1918, equivalent to perhaps $50 million in modern terms. The Deere board debated the purchase intensely, understanding they were betting the company's resources on a technology that had not yet proven itself in the marketplace. Steam tractors existed but were massive, expensive, dangerous machines that only the largest farms could justify. Gasoline tractors promised something different: smaller, more maneuverable, affordable enough for ordinary farmers. If the promise proved real, the company that controlled tractor manufacturing would dominate the next century of agriculture. If the promise proved false, $2.3 million would vanish into obsolete machinery and empty factories. They made the purchase, and history proved them brilliantly correct. The Model D tractor, introduced in 1923, became legendary among farmers who witnessed its capabilities. The specifications sound modest by modern standards: approximately 30 horsepower, maximum speed of 4 miles per hour, weight of 4,000 pounds. But those numbers disguised revolutionary capacity. The Model D could run continuously for 30 hours on 50 gallons of kerosene, pulling implements through soil that would have exhausted 30 horses. Where a farmer with a team of horses might plow 3 acres in a long day of brutal labor, the Model D could plow 40 acres in the same time, and the tractor never tired, never needed rest, never complained. The economic transformation was profound. A farmer who owned a Model D could work more land with less labor, could respond to weather windows more quickly, could plant and harvest with precision that horse-drawn equipment could never match. The initial cost was significant, often exceeding $1,000, but the productivity gains justified the investment within a few seasons for most farmers. Then came October 1929, when the stock market crashed and the American economy descended into the Great Depression. Farm income, already struggling through the 1920s due to overproduction and falling crop prices, collapsed completely. By 1932, farm income had dropped 92% from 1929 levels. 92%. Farmers who had been modestly prosperous found themselves unable to buy food, unable to pay taxes, unable to meet mortgage payments, watching their land slip away to banks and creditors. Every other agricultural equipment manufacturer responded to the crisis by demanding cash payment. No more credit, no more installment plans, no more trusting that farmers would eventually pay. Just cash on delivery, and if farmers did not have cash, they could not buy equipment. This seemed like prudent business practice, like protecting company assets in dangerous times, like the sensible response to economic catastrophe. John Deere's company did the opposite. They extended $6 million in credit to struggling farmers. $6 million lent to people who had no obvious means of repayment. Lent during the worst economic crisis in American history. Lent when every financial indicator suggested that many of these loans would never be repaid. The decision echoed the choice John Deere had made during the Panic of 1857. The same willingness to value relationships over immediate financial security, the same gamble that mercy would prove more profitable than collection. They went further. They accepted chickens and eggs as down payments on tractors. Imagine the scene. A farmer arrives at a Deere dealership, wanting to buy a tractor worth more than $1,000 but possessing no cash. Only a crate of chickens and a basket of eggs. Under normal business logic, the transaction cannot occur. Under Deere's Depression-era policies, the dealership accepts the chickens and eggs, assigns them a value, credits that value toward the tractor purchase, and arranges financing for the remainder. The company had become a commodities broker in addition to a manufacturer, trading in farm products so farmers could trade for farm equipment. The engineering team, meanwhile, continued innovating despite economic chaos. The Model A tractor appeared in 1934, introducing hydraulic lift systems that transformed implement management. Before hydraulics, raising a plow or cultivator at the end of a row required the farmer to dismount, walk to the implement, and manually crank it up using mechanical advantage that was still back-breaking work. The hydraulic system let farmers raise implements with a finger touch, a simple lever that redirected pressurized fluid to lift hundreds of pounds of steel as easily as lifting a cup of water. The Model B followed in 1935, designed for smaller farms that could not justify the Model A's size and cost. Both tractors featured improvements that seem minor until you understand their impact. Better steering, more comfortable seats, easier starting, more reliable operation in cold weather. Each improvement represented hundreds of engineering hours, field testing on real farms, conversations with farmers about what worked and what frustrated them. World War II transformed every American factory into part of the military-industrial complex, and Deere's factories were no exception. The company pivoted from agricultural equipment to war production with remarkable speed. Tank transmissions that could withstand battlefield abuse, aircraft parts manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, military tractors designed to operate in conditions that would destroy civilian equipment. Production lines that had built plows were retooled to build weapons. Workers who had shaped steel for farming shaped steel for combat. But even during wartime production, the engineering team continued developing agricultural innovations. They understood that the war would end, that soldiers would return to farms, that the post-war period would bring both challenges and opportunities that required new solutions. The self-propelled combine harvester they developed in secret, introduced in 1947, represented a quantum leap in grain harvesting efficiency. Before self-propelled combines, harvesting grain required separate operations: cutting, gathering, threshing, separating. The process was labor-intensive, time-dependent, vulnerable to weather that could destroy crops waiting to be harvested. The self-propelled combine did everything in one pass: cut the grain, separate the seeds from the chaff, collect the grain in an onboard tank, spread the remaining straw back on the field. One machine, one operator, one pass, and acres of grain harvested in hours instead of days. The Model R tractor arrived in 1949, the first Deere tractor with a diesel engine. Diesel fuel was cheaper than gasoline or kerosene, burned more efficiently, produced more power per gallon. The Model R generated 50 horsepower, a dramatic increase over earlier tractors, allowing farmers to pull larger implements, work faster, cover more ground in less time. The price was higher, approaching $3,000, but the productivity justified the cost for farmers working substantial acreage. Through the 1950s, tractor designs evolved rapidly. Enclosed cabs protected operators from weather and dust. Power steering reduced the physical effort of controlling heavy machinery. Multi-speed transmissions gave operators more control over speed and power. Live power, takeoff systems, let implements continue operating even when the tractor stopped moving. Each innovation addressed specific farmer complaints, solved specific problems, made farming less physically demanding and more productive. The company's credit policies during the Depression had created loyalty that manifested in market share. Farmers remembered who had extended credit when banks were foreclosing, who had accepted chickens when others demanded cash, who had treated them as partners rather than mere customers. That loyalty translated into purchasing decisions that persisted across generations. Sons bought Deere tractors because their fathers had bought Deere tractors, and their fathers had bought Deere tractors because John Deere had extended mercy during impossible times. By 1960, American agriculture had been completely transformed. The horse had vanished from most farms, replaced by tractors that were faster, stronger, and more versatile. Farmers who had struggled to work 80 acres with horses now easily managed 300 acres with mechanical power. Production per acre had increased through better seeds, better fertilizers, better pest control, but production per farmer had exploded, multiplying tenfold or more through mechanization that let one person do the work of many. The mechanical revolution that began with the Model D in 1923 had reshaped not just farming but rural America itself. Fewer farmers were needed to produce more food, creating migration from countryside to cities that transformed the nation's demographics. Small towns shrank as young people left for urban opportunities. Farms consolidated as successful operators bought land from neighbors who could not compete with mechanized efficiency. The changes were neither entirely good nor entirely bad, but were utterly irreversible, driven by technological capabilities that could not be uninvented and economic pressures that could not be ignored. Yet even as mechanical tractors reached their peak capabilities, as diesel engines generated hundreds of horsepower and hydraulic systems performed miracles of lifting and positioning, the next revolution was already emerging. Not in factories, but in laboratories. Not in steel and fuel, but in silicon and software. Not in mechanical advantage, but in digital intelligence that would make the smartest mechanical systems seem primitive by comparison. 24 satellites orbit Earth at an altitude of 12,000 miles, moving at speeds of 8,000 miles per hour, maintained by the United States military at a cost of billions of dollars. They exist primarily for navigation, for guiding missiles and ships and aircraft with precision that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. But in 1996, John Deere discovered they could also guide tractors, and agriculture would never be the same. The Green Star precision farming system transformed abstract satellite signals into concrete agricultural advantage. A receiver mounted on a tractor captures signals from multiple satellites simultaneously, triangulating position with accuracy measured in inches. 6 inches. On a field that might span hundreds of acres, on a planet with a circumference of 25,000 miles, satellites 12,000 miles overhead can tell a farmer exactly where the tractor is located to within 6 inches. The mathematical achievement is staggering, the practical applications revolutionary. Consider what this precision enables. A farmer planting corn wants to space rows exactly 30 inches apart for optimal plant growth and harvesting efficiency. Without guidance systems, maintaining that spacing across a half-mile field while accounting for slight steering variations and field irregularities is nearly impossible. The rows end up slightly crooked, slightly uneven, creating problems during cultivation and harvest. With satellite guidance, the tractor follows lines so precisely that rows planted in spring align perfectly with cultivation equipment in summer and harvesting equipment in fall. But location data is just the beginning. The yield monitors that Deere introduced alongside, Green Star transformed harvesting from simple grain collection into data gathering that would rival scientific research. Every 3 seconds, as the combine moves through the field, sensors measure moisture content, protein levels, and harvest weight. The system records this data along with exact GPS coordinates, creating maps that show not just average field productivity, but productivity variation down to areas smaller than most backyards. These maps reveal patterns invisible to human observation. The northwest corner consistently yields 10% less than the rest of the field. The area near the creek produces grain with higher protein content. The section that received extra fertilizer 3 years ago still shows elevated productivity. Armed with this knowledge, farmers can stop treating entire fields uniformly, can instead vary inputs based on precisely measured needs, can optimize every square foot rather than settling for averages. Modern tractors have become computers on wheels, generating data that would overwhelm human processing capacity. A single 8-wheel drive tractor, the kind used on large farms, generates 600 horsepower through engines monitored by 47 different sensors. Engine temperature, oil pressure, fuel consumption, hydraulic system pressure, wheel slippage, power takeoff speed, transmission temperature, every parameter tracked continuously, every measurement recorded, every anomaly flagged before it becomes failure. These tractors transmit 10 gigabytes of operational data daily to cloud servers, where algorithms analyze performance patterns. The analysis can predict component failure 3 weeks before it occurs, allowing scheduled maintenance instead of catastrophic breakdowns during critical planting or harvest windows. A bearing wearing unevenly, a hydraulic line developing microscopic leaks, an engine running slightly hotter than optimal. The system detects problems invisible to operators and schedules repairs before fields are left half-planted or crops left standing while equipment sits broken. The merger attempt with Monsanto in 2016 showcased how far agricultural technology had evolved beyond mechanical equipment. Monsanto, famous for developing herbicide-resistant crops and agricultural biotechnology, represented the biological side of farming innovation. John Deere represented the mechanical and digital side. The proposed $20 billion merger would have created a company controlling both what farmers plant and what they plant it with, combining seed genetics with precision planting equipment, integrating crop chemistry with data-driven application systems. Regulatory concerns ultimately blocked the merger, but the attempt revealed the convergence occurring across agriculture. The future would not be purely mechanical or purely biological or purely digital, but some integration of all three, where seeds contain genetic information matched to soil conditions, measured by sensors and planted by machines, guided by satellites, and nourished by fertilizers, applied at variable rates determined by algorithms processing years of accumulated data. The X9 combine harvester, introduced in 2020, represents the pinnacle of this convergence. The machine processes 100 acres of corn in 3 hours, moving through fields at speeds that seem reckless until you witness the precision. 8,000 bushels of grain separated from stalks, husks removed, kernels cleaned, moisture content measured, everything flowing into a storage tank, holding over 400 bushels while the machine never stops moving. But here is what makes the X9 remarkable beyond mere speed. It automatically adjusts 120 different parameters for optimal efficiency based on conditions that change every few feet. Grain moisture varies, so the threshing speed adjusts. Stalk density varies, so the cutting speed adjusts. Terrain slopes, so the leveling system adjusts to keep the machine operating efficiently, despite angles that would have tipped earlier combines. The operator monitors these adjustments through displays, showing real-time data but rarely intervenes because the machine optimizes better than humans can. The economics of precision agriculture create advantages that compound over time. A farmer using yield mapping discovers that 10 acres consistently underperform. Soil testing reveals those acres have pH levels too acidic for optimal corn growth. Lime application raises the pH, and the next year, those 10 acres produce an additional 50 bushels per acre. At $5 per bushel, that represents $2,500 in additional revenue from a lime application costing perhaps $300. The return on investment is obvious, but it required data that manual observation would never have captured. Variable rate fertilizer application produces similar gains. Instead of applying 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre across an entire field, precision systems might apply 200 pounds, where soil tests show nitrogen deficiency, and 100 pounds where nitrogen is adequate. The total fertilizer used stays the same or decreases, but the distribution matches plant needs rather than field averages. Yields increase, costs decrease or stay flat, and environmental impact decreases because excess fertilizer is not being wasted where plants cannot use it. The environmental benefits extend beyond efficiency. Precision agriculture reduces fuel consumption through optimized field operations that eliminate unnecessary passes, overlap, and wasted motion. It reduces chemical applications through targeted spraying that treats problems rather than entire fields. It reduces soil erosion through controlled traffic patterns that minimize compaction and preserve soil structure. These benefits accrue slowly, invisibly, but their cumulative impact over decades transforms farming from an activity that degrades land into one that can sustain it indefinitely. The data itself becomes valuable, becomes a resource that farmers can analyze to improve decisions, can sell to researchers studying agricultural productivity, can leverage to negotiate better terms with buyers who value the documentation of how crops were grown. A farmer who can demonstrate through recorded data that corn was grown with minimal chemical inputs, that soil health improved during the growing season, that water usage was optimized can command premium prices from consumers willing to pay for verified sustainable production. Yet the technology also creates dependencies that worry some observers. Farmers who adopt precision agriculture become reliant on satellite signals they do not control, software they do not fully understand, data systems they cannot repair. When systems fail, when software glitches, when satellites malfunction, the most advanced tractor becomes an expensive paperweight until technicians restore functionality. The self-sufficiency that characterized traditional farming, where a skilled farmer with basic tools could diagnose and repair most problems, has been replaced by systems requiring specialized knowledge and equipment. The cost of entry into modern precision agriculture creates barriers that favor large operations over small farms. A complete precision farming system, including guidance, yield monitoring, variable rate application, and data management software, can cost over $100,000. Large farms amortize this cost across thousands of acres, making the per-acre investment modest. Small farms struggle to justify the expense, fall behind in productivity, face pressure to sell to larger operations that can exploit technology advantages. This concentration trend worries people who value agricultural diversity, who believe that small and medium farms contribute to community vitality in ways that large operations cannot match. The most efficient agriculture might not be the most desirable agriculture if efficiency comes at the cost of rural community survival, if technology advantages drive consolidation that empties small towns and creates food production controlled by fewer and fewer entities. But the technology itself is neutral, and its future depends on decisions not yet made, on policies not yet written, on choices about who has access to tools that could democratize productivity or concentrate it. The digital revolution in agriculture has just begun, and the next chapter will determine whether these tools serve broad prosperity or narrow advantage, whether they sustain communities or concentrate power, whether they help feed tomorrow's 9 billion people or merely help some farmers dominate markets at the expense of others. The tractor moves through the field with no human hand on the wheel, no operator in the cab, no person anywhere nearby. It plants corn with precision measured in fractions of inches, adjusting depth and spacing and seed population based on soil conditions that change every 6 feet. The artificial intelligence controlling this autonomous machine makes 7,000 micro-decisions per minute, more decisions than a human operator could consciously process in an entire day of work. This is not future speculation but present reality, operating on farms right now, planting crops that will feed millions of people who will never know that algorithms determined where each seed was placed. The AI has been trained on 50 million acres of farming data, learning patterns invisible to human observation, discovering correlations between soil conditions and optimal practices that decades of agricultural science had missed. It knows that when soil temperature reaches 54 degrees Fahrenheit, at 4 inches depth and moisture content measures between 20 and 25%, corn seeds should be planted at precisely 1.8 inches depth for maximum germination rates. It knows this, not from following programmed rules, but from analyzing millions of planting events and their outcomes, from learning what works through data rather than theory. The autonomous tractor does not get tired, does not lose concentration, does not make errors because it is worried about finances or distracted by personal concerns. It operates 24 hours per day during critical planting windows, stopping only for refueling and maintenance. A single autonomous tractor can plant 500 acres in a day, work that would require multiple operators and machines using conventional methods. The economic advantage is substantial, but the consistency matters more. Every seed placed at optimal depth, optimal spacing, optimal conditions for the germination that determines ultimate yield. But autonomy is just one dimension of the revolution. The see and spray technology transforms weed control from chemical blanket to surgical precision. Cameras mounted on spray booms capture 52 images per second as equipment moves through fields at 12 miles per hour. Computer vision algorithms analyze each image, identifying individual weeds among crops, distinguishing between 30 different weed species, calculating size and growth stage to determine threat level. When a weed is detected, the system activates only the specific nozzle positioned over that weed, spraying a targeted dose while surrounding nozzles remain off. The reduction in herbicide use reaches 90% compared to traditional broadcast spraying, 90%. Instead of applying chemicals across entire fields to kill weeds that might occupy 5 or 10% of the area, the system treats only the weeds actually present. The economic savings are significant, but the environmental impact matters more. Less herbicide means less chemical entering soil and water, less exposure for beneficial insects, less pressure driving herbicide resistance in weed populations. The technology makes farming more profitable and more sustainable simultaneously, a combination that traditional approaches rarely achieved. Climate change reshapes agriculture with accelerating force. Growing zones shift northward at 3.8 miles annually as average temperatures rise and seasons extend. Crops that thrived in southern regions now struggle with heat stress, while northern regions that were too cold for certain crops now find themselves capable of supporting production. Farmers must adapt planting decisions continuously, replacing varieties that worked for decades with new varieties suited to changing conditions, learning to manage pests and diseases that historically did not exist in their regions but now arrive with warming temperatures. Water scarcity has become a more pressing concern than land scarcity in many regions. Aquifers that took thousands of years to fill are being depleted in decades by irrigation systems pumping more than rainfall can replenish. Rivers that once flowed year-round now run dry for months. Snowpack that fed summer irrigation has diminished, creating water shortages precisely when crops need it most. The competition for water between agriculture, cities, and industry intensifies annually, and agriculture, which consumes 70% of available fresh water globally, faces pressure to reduce consumption that threatens productivity. Precision irrigation responds to this crisis with technology that treats water as the precious resource it has become. Sensors buried in fields measure soil moisture at multiple depths every few minutes. Weather stations track evapotranspiration rates, calculating how much moisture crops are losing to atmosphere. Satellite imagery measures crop health indicators visible in wavelengths invisible to human eyes. All this data feeds algorithms that determine exactly when irrigation should occur, exactly how much water should be applied, exactly which field sections need water and which sections have adequate moisture. The exact emerge planter represents the integration of multiple technology streams into a single revolutionary system. It places seeds with 1/4 inch accuracy at speeds up to 10 miles per hour, spacing that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. But placement accuracy is only the foundation. The system varies seed population from 24,000 to 44,000 plants per acre, based on soil fertility maps created by satellites measuring chlorophyll fluorescence from space. The logic is elegant. Soil with high fertility can support dense plant populations that maximize yield per acre. Soil with marginal fertility cannot support dense populations without excessive plant competition that reduces overall productivity. By varying population to match fertility, the system optimizes yield across the entire field rather than settling for averages that underutilize good soil and overstress poor soil. The yield improvements range from 5 to 15%, differences that might seem modest until you calculate them across thousands of acres and realize they represent millions of dollars and millions of additional meals. But here is the question that haunts every discussion of agricultural technology. Will it be enough? The human population continues growing, heading toward 9 billion by 2050, while arable land actually decreases through urbanization, soil degradation, and climate impacts. We must produce more food on less land, using less water in more challenging conditions, and the mathematics of this equation resist easy solutions. Technology provides tools, but tools alone cannot guarantee success if population growth outpaces productivity improvements, or if climate change accelerates beyond adaptation capabilities. The optimistic scenario says that precision agriculture, genetic improvements, and resource optimization can increase productivity fast enough to feed 9 billion people while simultaneously reducing environmental impact, that farmers will adopt these technologies globally, that cost will decrease enough to make them accessible to small farms in developing nations, that policies will support rather than hinder the transition to sustainable intensification. In this scenario, agriculture becomes more productive and less destructive simultaneously. solving food security while addressing environmental concerns. The pessimistic scenario warns that technology serves primarily those who can afford it, that precision agriculture accelerates farm consolidation, that developing nations lack infrastructure to support advanced systems, that climate change proceeds faster than adaptation, that water scarcity creates conflicts that destabilize food production. In this scenario, technology improves outcomes for some, while others fall further behind. Food security becomes more rather than less precarious, and the gap between agricultural haves and have-nots widens into crisis. The truth likely falls between these extremes, will emerge from millions of individual decisions by farmers, policymakers, consumers, and technologists who shape agriculture's future through choices both large and small. What crops to plant, what technologies to adopt, what practices to subsidize, what research to fund, what environmental standards to enforce, what trade policies to implement. Each decision contributes to trajectories that compound over decades into outcomes we can influence but not fully control. Standing in a field in 2025, watching an autonomous tractor plant corn guided by satellites while artificial intelligence makes thousands of decisions per minute, it seems impossible that this technology emerged from a blacksmith's forge in Vermont, where a young orphan learned to shape iron. Yet the connection is direct, traceable through every innovation, from singing plow to steel moldboard to mechanical tractor to digital precision to autonomous intelligence. Each generation built on what previous generations created, solving new problems with tools their predecessors could not have imagined. John Deere died in 1886, 39 years before the first practical farm tractor, 70 years before computers, 110 years before GPS precision agriculture, 138 years before autonomous machines. He could not have predicted the specific technologies that would follow from his invention, but he understood something more fundamental: that agriculture matters, that feeding people well creates foundations for everything else. Civilization attempts that tools which help farmers succeed serve purposes beyond profit. The company bearing his name has outlasted its founder by nearly a century and a half, has evolved through transformations that make the original forge almost unrecognizable, has adapted to challenges ranging from financial panics to world wars to digital revolutions. The singing plow no longer sings in modern fields, but its descendants process grain at speeds measured in acres per minute rather than acres per day, guided by technologies that treat Earth itself as a garden, requiring individual attention rather than uniform treatment. We stand now at another threshold, facing challenges as significant as those John Deere faced when wooden plows broke against prairie soil. The climate changes. Water grows scarce. Population increases. Arable land decreases. The tools we develop in response to these challenges, the wisdom we apply in deploying them, the values we preserve while embracing change, will determine whether 9 billion people can be fed sustainably, or whether agriculture becomes another story of technology, solving some problems while creating others equally serious. The future remains unwritten, depends on choices not yet made, on innovations not yet conceived, on the willingness of each generation to build on what previous generations created while recognizing that past success does not guarantee future outcomes. The blacksmith's orphan who learned to shape metal in a Vermont forge could not have imagined satellites guiding tractors through fields thousands of miles away. We cannot imagine what tools our descendants will develop to solve challenges we cannot yet see clearly, but we can choose to approach those challenges with the same combination of practical skill and long-term vision that transformed a broken sawmill blade into an implement that helped feed a nation and eventually helped feed the world.